We're at the end of section 2-3. You definitely want to get out your pen, pencil, highlighter, sticky notes, etc. as we finish up this chapter talking about misleading graphs. So it says graphs give a visual representation that enables readers to analyze and interpret data more easily than they could simply by just looking at the numbers. However, inappropriately drawn graphs can misrepresent the data and lead the reader, either on purpose or not, to false conclusions. Thus, changing units on an XY scale can convey something very different. So what I've done is I've tried to make this pretty obvious about what I'm showing you. I'll even back this up some. Maybe I'll give you a taller picture. But as we are looking at these examples, we are looking at various ways that graphs can be misleading. So I would start an index card and just title it Misleading Graphs. And then on the back side, I would list these ways that graphs can be misleading, and maybe even jot like some little things on the side as to what it represents. So a first way is changing the units at the starting point on the y-axis. So I jot that down, and then I would notice right here, this y-axis is 95, 96, where it starts, and you see the graph. And it looks like there is a distinction. It is going down. But then if we notice the graph that actually starts at 0 and then goes up with correct spacing to 100, you don't really notice a major change of this going down. So one way that graphs can be misleading, as it says here, changing the units at the starting point on the y-axis can convey a different visual representation. So if you were asked what is misleading about this graph, or is this a way to mislead on a graph, or list 3 different ways that graphs can be misleading, know that one way is to mess around with numbers on the y-axis. I would keep my card going, and then that brings us to the next page on a second one. It is not wrong to truncate an axis of a graph, and many times it is necessary to do so. However, the reader should be aware of this fact and interpret the graph accordingly. Do not be misled if an inappropriate impression is given. So a second way, again, changing the units at the starting point of the y-axis, one can change the visual representation. So looking right here, 0, starting at 21. And when I'm doing graphs, I even like to put something like this that indicates I know that I've jumped. And to me, this is the same. It's not changing units, but it is changing the starting point. So right now, I've got a second visual, but I still think that they're the same thing. If you are messing with the y-axis, that is a way to really mess up the visual representation. Because when it's true, starting at 0, there is not much difference. But when you truncate it and start closer in, like at the 21 and the other one started really close to the 100, you start to notice a difference, and you might interpret this graph differently. So that's one. Here comes a second one. And you can just look at these drawings and kind of giggle, and then we'll go to the words. Another misleading graphing technique sometimes used involves exaggerating. So another technique is exaggerating one-dimensional increase by showing it in 2 dimensions. And so up here, the 30-second Super Bowl is shown on 2 different graphs, one for 97 and one for 2015. Nothing's misleading on the y-axis, and this looks, pretty stark in contrast. But when you see this right here, this looks like, it's going to swallow it up, and that poor little number over here, I used to say, or I have said, and have heard people say, if it doesn't pass the stink test, don't use it. And this thing it looks ridiculous. So don't be ridiculous. Figure 2-23 represents the change in the comparison by the heights of the 2 bars, and it's in 1 dimension. We're talking height. But when you get to the one beside it, notice that the difference seems much larger because the eye is comparing the areas of the circles rather than the lengths of the diameters. So instead of this little piece and that piece, or just this little piece and just this piece, it's gone two-dimensional with width and height. Note that it is not wrong to use the graphing techniques of truncating the scales, like we already mentioned on the y-axis, or representing the data by two-dimensional pictures, but we're using lots of buts and lots of howevers. When these techniques are used, the reader should be cautious of the conclusions that you draw on the basis of the graphs. And so now we're looking at number 4. We've got an arrow drawn down here to the bottom, another way to misrepresent. And so we've only talked about 2 ways, messing around with the y-axis, using two-dimensional up here to make it look wonky. Another way is by omitting labels or units, and then people just start to add in what they think it is or what they want to make of it. But omitting information on the axes of the graph. The graph shown below, down here, it is comparing the cost of living, the economic growth, the population growth of 4 main geographic areas in the United States. However, since there are no numbers on the y-axis, very little information can be gained except a crude ranking of each factor. There's no way to decide the actual magnitude of the differences. So don't hide. Be very visible in what your information means, even giving it scales and what's going on. Be very clear. Don't try to be vague. Finally, all graphs should contain a source for the information presented. The inclusion of a source for the data will enable you to check the reliability of the organization presenting the data. So that does conclude our section 2-3. And I made a huge note here, considering doing this 2-3 homework in groups or with tutoring. You may have noticed that even the last set of homework and this set of homework can be challenging. I don't want you to quit. I want you to keep going. And so part of that includes reaching out for help. You can always use Ask My Instructor, but as you're working on the homework, it might be good to do it in groups the best that you can. That's probably going to be virtually, using our online tutoring. You can also do like some FaceTime with each other or Skype or Zoom. Lots of different things that you can do. Don't do this alone. Don't go at it alone.